Did you know some projections are suggesting mixed reality might actually grow faster than VR, like really soon?
Oh, yeah.
It just kind of highlights how important it is we get a handle on measuring these experiences and, quickly.
That really is the fascinating crux of what we're looking at today, isn't it? It's not just like smoother graphics or faster chips.
Right.
We're talking about something really subjective, how real these digital things feel. And, as mixed reality starts blending more and more with our physical world, well, the ways we've been measuring might just be missing the mark.
Okay, yeah, let's unpack this because
Yeah.
for this deep dive, you, our listener, sent over some really interesting research. It really focuses on the limits of how we measure that being there.
Yeah.
Presence,
Yeah.
right? Especially across the whole MR spectrum.
Right.
So we're going to dig into a study that shows why those standard questionnaires might be falling short now that the digital and physical are so intertwined.
Exactly. The research you shared points to a really key difference.
Yeah.
A lot of the tools we use now, the ones for evaluating how immersive something feels,
Mm-hmm.
they were mostly built with VR in mind.
Where you're totally cut off.
Yes, right, where the goal is often complete detachment from, the real room you're in. But mixed reality is, well, it's a different animal. It overlays digital stuff onto your actual surroundings.
Mm-hmm.
And that just fundamentally changes how we perceive it, how we interact.
Mm-hmm.
So our mission today is to really understand why assessing immersion in MR is so tricky.
Okay.
And then to explore this new model, researchers are proposing, it's called congruence and plausibility, or CAPI for short.
CAPI, got it.
And see how this fresh look might help us build better ways to evaluate, your experience in these blended realities.
So let's maybe paint the scene a bit first. VR and MR, they're not just for gaming anymore, right? They're moving into some serious applications.
Oh, absolutely. The market growth is huge, billions projected, and the applications are just exploding.
Yeah.
Think about VR for psychotherapy, creating safe spaces to deal with anxiety.
Yeah.
Or MR in product design, letting engineers manipulate virtual prototypes right there on their physical workbench.
Yeah.
It's got massive potential.
And with all these different headsets, different tech approaches coming out, it feels like we really need a solid way to compare them, beyond just the tech specs.
Precisely. And the tech side of MR is still, it's still evolving a lot.
Yeah.
There are ongoing challenges, things like a limited field of view, latency issues.
But a little lag.
Yeah, that delay between your movement and the system reacting.
Right.
Then there's resolution and something called the vergence accommodation conflict.
Oh, right, where your eyes get confused.
Kind of, yeah. They try to focus at one distance but point at another. Causes eye strain. So because of all these variables, comparing different MR tech to see what works best for a specific task is, it's often pretty essential.
And I'm guessing those comparisons need to go deeper than just frame rates. It's about the user's feeling, how real it feels. Right?
Exactly right. Comparative studies often look at usability. Is it easy to use?
Mm-hmm.
Cognitive load. How much brain power does it take? Physiological stuff like simulator sickness and, those technical specs. But, as the research points out, especially for training simulations, that feeling of presence, like you're actually there in the simulation, that's super important for skills to transfer back to the real world.
If you don't feel like you're there, the training doesn't really stick.
Pretty much, yeah. The learning might not transfer effectively.
Okay, so this brings us back to presence. It sounds like that's been the main way we measure immersion, particularly in VR. What exactly is it, and where does it start to kind of stumble when we move into mixed reality?
So presence, as the research lays it out, is basically that feeling that your virtual experience is, real. It's often split into two main parts. First, there's place illusion.
Place illusion.
That's the feeling of actually being in a real place, even though it's totally digital, like putting on a VR headset and feeling you're standing on Mars.
Got it. Your brain thinks it's physically somewhere else.
Exactly. And the second part is plausibility illusion.
Plausibility illusion.
That's the feeling that the scenario happening around you is believable, it's credible within that virtual world. So even if you know you're in VR, the events feel like they could realistically happen there.
Okay. Place and plausibility. Makes sense. Separate things. But what's the problem when we get to MR? It's not a totally separate world then, is it?
And that's really the core of the challenge. Traditional presence models, they kind of struggle to tell the difference between that place illusion in VR, that total break from reality, and what the researchers call placeness in MR.
Placeness, okay.
In MR, you're still anchored in the real world. Think about playing virtual Jenga, where the blocks appear on your actual kitchen table. Are you feeling like you're in a new place?
Yeah.
Or are you just interacting with virtual stuff in your normal room?
Yeah.
The lines get really, really blurry.
Right, because you're not just in a digital space. Your office, your living room. That's still a huge part of it.
Precisely. And those existing questionnaires for VR presence, like the IPQ, that's the iGroup Presence Questionnaire, or the PQ, the Presence Questionnaire, they were mostly developed and tested for those fully immersive VR situations.
Okay.
How well they apply to the whole MR spectrum, where virtual and real are constantly mixing, that hasn't really been looked at in depth.
And the researchers whose work you shared, they actually tested this, didn't they? They tried using one of those VR questionnaires for MR.
They did, yeah, a pilot study. They modified the IPQ and used it in both a full VR setup and a video see-through MR setup.
Yeah.
They used a Varjo XR3 headset.
Video see-through. So cameras showing the real world with virtual stuff added.
Exactly. And the task was pretty simple. Find and touch numbers on a grid.
Okay, and what happened? Did the modified questionnaire pick up the differences between VR and MR?
Well, the results were, let's say, mixed. Interestingly, people clearly preferred VR. They said they felt less cyber sickness compared to MIRR. Any day way.
The researchers think that cyber sickness in MIRR might have been linked to that slight delay, the latency, in the camera feed. It creates a subtle mismatch between what you see and what your body feels.
Ah, okay.
But the main thing was the modified IPQ questionnaire didn't really distinguish between the two experiences like they expected. Some questions that make perfect sense in VR just felt ambiguous or didn't quite fit the MR context for the participants.
So the tool designed to measure being there didn't really capture that fundamental difference between being fully immersed versus having virtual things overlaid on reality. That really shows the limitations they're talking about.
Exactly. It really suggests that a framework built around the idea of complete perceptual illusion, where you basically forget the real world, might just not be the best fit for understanding experiences where the real world is always there, always influencing things.
That pilot study really drove home the need for a new way to think about and measure immersion in MADARN.
Okay, so if presence, as we've known it, isn't quite the right fit for MR, what's the alternative? This is where that congruence and plausibility model CAP comes in.
That's right. The researchers proposed this CAP model as a potentially better framework. Instead of focusing on the illusion of being somewhere else,
Right.
CAP focuses on plausibility. And this plausibility arises from the congruence of cues across different layers of how we process information: cognitive, perceptual, and sensory.
Congruence of cues. Okay, break that down a bit more for me.
Think of congruence as like the objective alignment between the information your brain is getting and what it expects based on everything you already know and have experienced.
Okay.
In the CAP model, this matching happens across those three layers. What's really interesting here is that this model doesn't hinge on creating a perfect illusion. It suggests that in MR, the experience of plausibility is very much real because it's based on objective representations that line up with your subjective perceptions.
So it's less about tricking your brain into thinking it's somewhere else and more about creating an experience that feels consistent and believable based on all the signals you're getting.
Exactly. And the CAP model isn't necessarily trying to pin down or measure specific feelings like presence. Instead, it suggests that plausibility can generate various subjective states. They call them qualia, which could include presence, but doesn't have to.
Qualia, like the individual quality of an experience.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Like the specific redness of red you see or that feeling of being there, plausibility is seen as the foundation.
Interesting. So plausibility comes first, and feelings like presence might emerge from it, but they're not the only outcome.
Right. And while measuring those specific subjective feelings directly is, inherently difficult, other research has shown that higher plausibility often correlates with higher feelings of presence anyway.
Okay.
So maybe we should dive into those three layers of the CAP model: sensation, perception, cognition. That might make the congruence idea clearer.
Sounds good. Let's start at the bottom with sensation.
Okay, layer one. Sensation. This is the very first stage, processing all the raw sensory signals coming in. At this level, your brain's checking how well these signals match up with your basic biology and physiology.
So, does it look right, sound right, feel right at a fundamental level?
Exactly. It's about the physical fidelity of the simulation. Sensory congruence in MR means the virtual sensory cues you're getting, visual, auditory, haptic, feel, consistent with how you know the physical world works.
So if I reach out in MR to touch a virtual button and I get some kind of feedback, like a little vibration, that matches the action. That helps sensory congruence.
Precisely. If the look, the sound, the feel all work together in a way that makes basic physical sense, that builds sensory congruence and contributes to the overall plausibility.
Okay, makes sense. What's the next layer up?
Layer 2 is perception. This goes beyond just the raw input. It's about how your brain interprets that information, making sense of it, bringing in other factors that shape your understanding.
Can you give an example of that in MR?
Sure. Think about those simple animated line drawings you sometimes see on a flat screen. But they can give you a really strong feeling of moving through a 3D tunnel.
Oh, yeah, I know what you mean.
That's your perceptual layer, interpreting basic visual cues to create a sense of depth or emotion that isn't literally there in the raw data. That's perceptual congruence. And importantly, if things at this layer feel wrong, like if objects just don't behave according to perceived physics, it can really mess with the higher cognitive stuff.
Right, because if something looks like it defies gravity when it shouldn't, that's going to pull you out of the experience, make it less believable.
Exactly. And this layer also involved the functional side, how you actually interact with things. If something feels off at the sensory or perceptual level, it can ripple upwards and affect the cognitive layer too.
Okay, sensation, perception, that leaves the top layer. Cognition, what's happening there in the CAP model?
The cognitive layer deals with the higher level thinking, especially the consistency of the narrative or the story within the simulation.
Narrative consistency, like does the simulation follow its own rules?
Yeah, partly. A good example is your avatar, your virtual representation in a Mamarar. If it looks and moves very much like you do in real life, that can really boost your sense of presence, your emotional connection, your acceptance of the whole thing.
So if my virtual hands look like my hands and move when I move mine, that helps the cognitive feeling that this is me doing this.
Exactly. But the model also suggests that while this narrative consistency is important, inconsistencies at this cognitive level might have a smaller impact on overall plausibility compared to violations at the sensory or perceptual levels.
Interesting.
The research mentioned an example. Giving people a perfectly logical reason for why there's no gravity in a simulation didn't actually change their overall feeling of plausibility all that much.
So a good story helps, but if the basic physics or visuals feel totally wrong, the story alone might not save it.
That seems to be the idea. And it's important to remember that both perception and cognition are also shaped by your individual experiences. What you've learned, your memories, your expectations, what you're paying attention to. So what feels plausible can vary a bit person to person.
Okay, so this CAP model gives us a different lens, focusing on how well cues align across these layers, rather than just that feeling of being in a virtual place. So how do they turn this into a better way to measure things across the whole MR spectrum?
Right, that's the critical next step. Because those traditional presence questionnaires had shortcomings, the researchers wanted to build a new questionnaire, one based directly on the CAP model.
Okay.
The goal was a tool that could more accurately capture that subjective experience, whether it's full VR, augmented reality, or anything in between on that mixed reality continuum.
And how did they build it? Did they just make up new questions?
No, not at all. It was quite systematic. They started by really digging into the existing research that had already used or referenced the CAP model.
To see how others were thinking about it.
Exactly. How were other researchers defining and measuring congruence and plausibility? And a key thing that came out of that review was this idea of splitting plausibility into two main types, internal and external.
Internal and external plausibility. Okay, what's the difference there?
Internal plausibility, IP, is about the coherence and consistency within the simulation's own narrative. Do the actions and events make sense together? Does it build a coherent mental model for you?
Ah, so it follows its own internal logic.
Right. If something breaks that internal logic, it disrupts your engagement, makes you work harder mentally to figure it out, increases cognitive load. This links back closely to that cognitive layer we talked about.
So if a character in a game suddenly acts completely out of character for no reason, that would be a break in internal plausibility.
Exactly. It violates the established rules of that simulated world. Then there's external plausibility.
Okay.
That's about how well the simulation lines up with your knowledge of the real world, your intuition, your normal habits. This works more automatically, often subconsciously. EP connects more to the sensory and perceptual layers of CAPI.
So if I reach for a virtual cup in MR and my hand just passes straight through it, that violates my real-world expectation of solid objects. That's a lack of external plausibility.
Precisely. It breaks your fundamental understanding of physics. Now, the researchers found that existing plausibility questionnaires had some good stuff, but also limitations.
Like what?
Some weren't properly validated, some questions were too generic, maybe didn't capture nuances. And crucially, many didn't put enough emphasis on external plausibility, which, as we said, seems really important for MR, where you're still grounded in reality.
So they needed something more specific, more robust, built on CAP.
Exactly. So, to build their new questionnaire, they looked at how CAP overlaps with existing presence models, especially the parts related to immersion. They decided to map their ideas onto the presence questionnaire, the PQ, because it seemed to cover aspects of immersion that fit well with external plausibility.
Oh.
So they took items from the PQ subscales about immersion, involvement, sensory fidelity, things like how good the visuals, audio, interaction, movement, haptics felt and adapted them.
So they borrowed relevant bits from existing tools and framed them within this new plausibility idea.
Correct. And for the internal plausibility side, they looked at previous research specifically on plausibility and narrative. They added questions about the quality and consistency of the story or the sequence of events in the simulation.
Right, because a coherent story can make even a fantasy world feel more plausible in its own way.
Exactly. They even cleverly looked at scales used to measure narrative believability in totally different fields, like how believable jurors find arguments or how convincing ads are, and adapted those ideas for simulations.
That's smart, drawing parallels from how we judge believability elsewhere.
It is. They also figured that internal implausibility, when the simulation's logic breaks down, could make it more mentally tiring for the user.
Increases cognitive load, right?
Right. So they included 6 relevant items from a modified version of the NASA TLX, which is a standard workload measure. They picked items focused on things like mental fatigue, feeling rushed, stress, complexity, distractibility within the simulation. They were careful to only include things related to the cognitive side of internal plausibility.
So a buggy or inconsistent simulation doesn't just feel less believable, it might also make you feel more stressed or mentally drained.
That's the idea. And then finally, just to get an overall gut check, they added one single general question. The overall experience appeared plausible.
Okay, so after pulling all that together, what does this new questionnaire actually look like? How many questions are we talking?
The final proposed questionnaire has 33 items. 17 focus on external plausibility, the alignment with the real world. 15 items cover internal plausibility, the coherence within the simulation.
Right.
And then that one general question about overall plausibility.
And how do people answer? Like a scale?
Yeah, it's a 7-point Likert scale for each item, from strongly disagree to strongly agree. Higher scores mean more perceived plausibility. And it's designed as a post-experience thing. You fill it out after using the MR system or whatever simulation.
Can you give an example or two? What does an external plausibility question sound like?
Sure. Some examples they adapted from the PQ are things like, I felt effortlessly engaged in the auditory aspects of the environment, or I was able to effortlessly survey or explore the environment using touch.
Ah, so how natural and intuitive the senses felt compared to normal life.
Exactly.
And what about internal plausibility? What's an example there?
For IP, you might see modified items like, I could not anticipate what would happen next in the scenario, which gets at predictability and logical flow. Or maybe, the behavior of objects or characters in the environment aligned seamlessly with the scenario. Plus those combined narrative consistency items like, the scenario presented in the simulated environment was consistent. And of course, those SimTLX workload questions are in this section too.
So it's probing both how it feels against reality and how consistent it is within its own world, plus that one overall question.
Exactly. It aims to be a much more comprehensive way to look at the experience across the whole MR range by breaking down plausibility like this.
Now, this sounds really promising, a much better fit perhaps, but the researchers are clear this questionnaire isn't like fully baked and validated yet, right?
That's a really crucial point, yes. They absolutely acknowledge it needs formal validation. The paper actually lays out a very detailed plan for how they intend to validate it, using standard methods from scale development theory.
What does that involve? Who takes part?
Well, first, they're very specific about who should participate in the validation studies. Normal vision, no history of epilepsy or bad motion sickness, things like that. They want to know about prior VR/MR gaming experience.
Makes sense.
Adults only. A mix of experts and novices, good English skills. They also mention using a Bayesian approach to analysis, which means they won't need a fixed sample size up front. They can add more people as they go.
Okay.
The first validation step is a card sorting task. They'll get experts in the field and also potential users to actually try out VR and MR,
Right.
and then physically sort the questionnaire items into the three categories, EP, IP, and general plausibility, based on which ones seem similar. It helps see if the questions really group together the way the theory suggests.
Like getting experts to confirm if the questions seem to measure what they're supposed to measure.
Exactly. They'll use stats to check agreement and maybe tweak the structure. Then comes a bigger study. Participants will do a task, like a memory game, in different conditions: real world, MR, and VR. Afterwards, they fill out the new plausibility questionnaire. This gives them a large data set.
For more stats.
Right. They'll use exploratory factor analysis, EFA, likely Bayesian EFA, to see if those three factors, EP, IP, and general, actually emerge statistically from the data.
Do the answers cluster together as expected?
Precisely. They'll also check the reliability of each factor, see if any questions are maybe lowering the consistency and should be removed.
Okay, refining the tool.
Then, using Bayesian confirmatory factor analysis, or BCFA, they'll test how well the final set of items fits the underlying theory. Importantly, they say they need a new group of participants for this confirmation step. It's all about making sure the questionnaire is reliable and valid.
Sounds very thorough. A lot of steps.
It is. And finally, they plan to compare their validated plausibility questionnaire against other established measures, specifically the UM-UX Lite, which is a short, standard way to measure overall user satisfaction.
Why that one?
Because other research suggests plausibility and enjoyment are often correlated. So if their plausibility scores line up with user satisfaction scores, it provides more evidence that their questionnaire is measuring something meaningful about the user experience in FIR.
So to kind of wrap this up, the big takeaway seems to be that our old ways of measuring immersion, mostly presence for VR, might not really capture the full picture for mixed reality, where the real world is still very much involved.
Exactly. This research really highlights the limits of just focusing on the illusion of being somewhere else when evaluating MER. It suggests this plausibility framework, looking at the congruence across sensory, perceptual, and cognitive levels, might be a more useful way to think about these blended experiences.
And this isn't just, theory for academics, right? Getting this measurement right actually matters.
Oh, absolutely. It's crucial if we want to design better training tools that actually work, or create prototypes in engineering or architecture that feel truly informative. Ultimately, it's about making sure our interactions with MR tech are valuable, intuitive, and don't just overwhelm us or make us feel sick.
So what's next then? This new questionnaire sounds like it's still got a ways to go.
You're absolutely right. The 33-item questionnaire is a great starting point, a proposal. But like the researchers stressed, it needs that tough validation process they outlined. But now the scientific community has this framework, this tool, and a plan to test it. It's a solid base for more work in this really important area.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? As VR and MR become, more and more part of our lives, how is our basic idea of reality itself going to change? And what role will frameworks like this Plausibility One play in how we perceive it all? Definitely something to chew on. Thanks for diving into this with me.